Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sunday's Other Scriptures for June 4th. We are on Holy Trinity Sunday, and we have some interesting readings for Holy Trinity Sunday. I'm going to be preaching off of Matthew 28, 16 to 20, which are the famous last words of Jesus in Matthew. That is what he told his disciples before he ascended into heaven, and it includes what's come to be known as the Great Commission. But I'm going to be focusing on not that commission, but on the God who commissioned us, on the Trinity, because it's Trinity Sunday. And the Holy Trinity appears in our readings for this morning, especially the Genesis reading and the one from Acts, and also the Matthew reading. So let's just walk through those. The first reading is Genesis chapter 1. It is the creation account, and we have the option of reading the entire creation account. I gave us just a snippet at the beginning, and then the sixth day of creation. So we start with the creation of heaven and earth, and notice already in the first and second verse you have evidence for the Holy Trinity, namely that the name of God, Elohim, is actually plural. We translate it God because we understand that he's one God, but you could translate it the gods, and it comes out in English in the second sentence when it says that the Holy Spirit, or the Spirit of God, was hovering over the waters, hovering over the void. And so right away we're told that the Spirit of God was involved with God in creation. Contrary to what some people who say, that the Father created and the Son redeemed and the Holy Spirit sustains us. No, the Spirit was right there as part of creation, and so was Jesus. So this is the first bit of evidence of that. I skipped to the sixth day of creation, which is the creation of mankind, because again, you get this idea. God says, let us, plural, make man in our image. And so he made them in his image, them, both male and female, which was a sticking point in my last congregation for one of the guys who insisted that only men were made in God's image. No. Men and women were made both in God's image. And this plural nature of the God who works in creation, even though he's one God, and Israel's Shema, their famous proclamation, was, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one." When the word Lord is used, of Yahweh is the Hebrew, it's always to emphasize the one God, the God who is eternal. When God is broken into plurals, as he is in the creation account, it's the God who breaks into time. And I'm going to be trying to emphasize that or explain that a little bit in my sermon. But when God works for our creation or our redemption, he tends to be Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. When we're talking about God in eternity, outside of time, he tends to be one God. So this is a reading from the beginning of Genesis that talks about humanity. And an interesting thing I noticed when I read this is we talk a lot about, well, what is the image of God? It's obviously not a physical resemblance, right? People have suggested, well, it's creativity, or it's intelligence, or it's whatever separates us from the other animals, which it is. But you notice in this verse, the image of God is the authority to rule over creation, because God has the authority to rule over the universe, which he created. Mankind was given authority over a very small part of the universe. However, when we get to our Psalm 8, David marvels at the fact that God, who created the universe, would even think about us, much less that he would make us a little bit lower than the angels and give us authority over the creation, over all created things. And by authority, we're called to exercise that authority the way God would. That is, for the good of creation. So rule over sounds a little bit harsh, but it's more like be responsible for creation. I wanted to point out that in the initial reading from Genesis 1, notice that every green plant and seed-bearing plant and so on was given for food to all of the animals and to Adam and Eve. That is to say, everybody was a vegetarian. including humanity. It was only after the fall that humans were given the animals to eat. So I can't answer about about milk and so on, things like that. But initially, humanity was vegetarian. So we get to this Psalm, Psalm 8. The night sky, as I said, makes this impression on David, as it is for us a lot of times. It's very humbling to think that the God who made the universe would take notice of us. But we're given this privilege of ruling over creation or stewarding creation or being responsible for creation. It's interesting. I think part of the reason this psalm is included on this Sunday is because it starts and ends with how majestic is your name. And that's what I'm going to focus on in the sermon is what do we mean by the name of God, especially if God is triune? And in this psalm, how majestic is your name? It's clearly not talking about the word Jesus. It's clearly not even talking about the word Yahweh or anything like that. It's clearly talking about the character, the identity, the authority of God, the compassion, the kindness of God. This is all part of his name, is his character. And I want to focus on that because the nature of God is majestic. It's what we worship. And that nature of God, in whose image we're made, ought to then be expressed in our lives as well. So that takes us to Acts chapter 2. Last week we had the beginning of chapter 2 where the Holy Spirit came on the early believers and Peter stands up to speak to the people in Jerusalem who were there for the Pentecost Harvest Festival. And we get more of his sermon this week. There's the verse 14 is included just to remind us of the context that Peter stands up and speaks to all the crowd that's amazed because of the wind and the fire and so on that's taking place and the disciples speaking in various tongues that they haven't studied in people's home languages. And we get more of Peter's sermon. And at first it's bad news. You killed the Messiah. And you should have known better because he was accredited to you by signs and wonders. Right? But then but here's the good news. He was raised from the dead. Death couldn't keep its hold on him, which is an interesting turn of phrase that I hope you'll explore. And then Peter goes to King David. Can't do any better than King David as an authority for the Jewish people, not only because he was the great king of a united Israel, but also because he had prophetic gifts and he wrote many of the Psalms. So Peter turns to the Psalms and says, hey, this was what David was predicted when he said, that you would not let your Holy One see decay. The Jews had apparently misunderstood this to think that David was talking about himself. But Peter says, no. We know where David's grave is. It's right here in Jerusalem to this day. And this is one of, several historic accounts of King David's grave being in Jerusalem. To this day, nobody knows where David is buried. We don't know. But there apparently was a monument in a place that David was buried that was later destroyed, perhaps by the Romans when they leveled Jerusalem. We just don't know. It may be that someday it'll be found and identified, but we just don't know. But in Peter's day, they knew that David's grave was in Jerusalem and that David had stayed dead. But he had predicted that the Holy One would not see decay, and the Holy One actually was not David, it was Jesus. So Peter concludes, he says, hey, this wasn't about David. This was about Jesus. And God has made Jesus both Lord and Christ. This is the crux of his sermon. No pun intended. Crux means, like cross. This is the bottom line of his sermon. That first of all, it's interesting that God made Jesus both Lord and Christ. It's related to this idea of Jesus being raised up to the right hand of God, to the place of authority. And we say, well, how can that be if there's just one God? And so that's what we need to discover on Trinity Sunday. But the idea is Jesus wasn't just the Messiah, which means the Christ, the anointed one, the descendant of David, the one who would come to free all people, not just the Jews, but all nations from sin. He was also Lord. And sorry, phone. So this is kind of an amazing thing. It's a statement of Jesus being both eternal God, the Lord, Yahweh, and the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God, both at the same time. That's why this verse is part of our readings for Holy Trinity Sunday. It explores some of that, and that Jesus was made this. He already was Lord, but he was made the Christ. So there it is. I hope you have a great conversation about the Holy Trinity based on these other scriptures. The Lord bless your week.